Welcome back to the class, and we are continuing our discussion on globalization and culture. In the previous class, we spent some time trying to understand the concept of culture, especially its trajectory in the discipline like anthropology. And we found that this term, while being extremely popular in English language as well as in disciplines like sociology or anthropology, does not have a given definition, or does not have a definition which is not changing. Okay, the ideas about culture, the conception of culture, the arguments about culture, they keep changing. So we had a brief detour into the evolution of different meanings of culture, and we saw how within the discipline of anthropology there were different attempts to make sense of this culture and to understand it as an interpretative mechanism, and to understand how or to use various semiotic ways of making sense of this whole culture. Now, following from that, we are moving to the next class, which is more directly related to the whole question of culture and globalization. So I don't think I need to re-emphasize the importance of culture or cultural globalization in understanding this whole phenomenon of globalization, because like the political or economic or social dimensions of globalization, cultural globalization is also an extremely important or central aspect of globalization. And this class as well, I'm using this book, a user's cultural globalization, a user's guide by McGregor Weiss. So cultural globalization needs to be understood through a theory of culture, territory and identity. A territory is an area of influence that one has. So where do you locate this whole notion of culture in globalization debate? Because you know that in the tradition of anthropology, culture was seen as those capabilities or beliefs or value systems or ideas that are that are internalized or used by the people of a particular society. And that's how mostly the tribal societies were understood. So in that sense, it was much easier to make sense of or to understand culture as a sum total of all their belief system, values and cultures and knowledge, everything that they have produced as a member of their society. But in a globalized society, that definition becomes inadequate, because in a globalized society, you are no longer isolated entities. Our societies are no longer completely insulated societies. There is very strong cross-cultural flows taking place. We are all living in an integrated society. So in that scenario, the author McGregor would argue that cultural globalization needs to be understood through a theory of culture, territory and identity. The relationship between culture, territory and identity is something very important, and globalization takes place through these categories. You need to understand globalization as a process taking place through the categories of culture, territory and identity. And territory he defines as an area of influence that one has. It's a very broad definition. Usually when we talk about territory, we understand territory as a given geographic area. Okay, but in this literature, territory does not have that notion of a geographic thing. A territory is a more broadly defined. Okay, maybe you are an Indian but you live in London, so your room becomes a territory for you. Okay, where you want to create your own space. Okay, so it's an area of influence that one has. So in your room, that you have certain influence and you want to create that space as per your wishes. Maybe you want to put up the photos of Indian gods and goddesses. You want to put up the posters of Indian film stars or Indian cricket stars, or your family members' photos. Okay, or you want to create an Indian atmosphere to your house or to your room. But the moment you step out of your room, it's completely different place. Okay, so similarly, places in UK or another place which are predominantly inhabited by Indians, Okay, so that locality again has this kind of a particular character, maybe with temples or Indian restaurants or Indian shops, a host of things. So you realize that that place gets a character of an Indian territory not only because of these physical objects, but it's also a kind of a cultural object. Okay, so this argument that in era of globalization you are trying to understand culture as something very closely connected with territory and identity. Okay, so you have this connection which are extremely interconnected. So each territory draws on a culture. Okay, because it is the territory, as I mentioned, territory, we don't really talk about the geographical boundary, but rather the kind of a space or the kind of a quality associated with a kind of a space. Each territory draws on a culture, but it is not completely representative of that culture. Each territory may draw on elements from diverse cultures and inflect them in a particular way. Those cultural elements used to mark territory and identity are also those that mark it possible to move through and live in society. The territory needs to be recreated continuously. Okay, so again, this whole idea of territory is not a static one. Okay, you constantly recreate that particular place. You need to constantly reconstitute that particular place. And it doesn't mean that a particular space, because you draw upon a particular culture, that culture gives a definitive character to that particular space. It doesn't give a kind of particular identity to that particular place. Okay, the very fact that you are from India, that does not give you a kind of a particular identity the way you want. Okay, so the cultural elements used to mark territory and identity are also those that make it possible to move through and live in society. Okay, so these for example, for a group of devout believers. Okay, so for example, any particular religious sect, how do they create that sense of identity that they belong to a particular religious sect? What are the kind of identity markers that they use? Okay, how do they constantly create a space for themselves? Okay, so that it has this very unique, distinct identity of, as the followers of a particular religious guru or those who follow a kind of a particular religious sect. How do they constantly recreate that? What are the kind of a cultural resources that they draw upon? So it's a very dynamic process which are inflected through these categories of culture, territory and identity. So the link between the process of territorialization and processes of identity. So there is a kind of a link between the processes of territorialization and the processes of identity formation. Identity is part of one's own self-formation, but also the consequence of what groups and others impose one. The concept of identity as territorialization is important to understand cultural debates about identity. Okay, so this is again something very, very important. We know that identity is not always what we want others to see as. Okay, we want to create a kind of a particular identity for ourselves, and this could be an individual identity, this could be a caste identity, this could be a social group identity, this could be an identity for a particular linguistic group or a religious group or a caste group or an ethnic group. But it's also equally important that how others see you, what are the ways in which others concede to your demands to be seen in a particular way. So it's always a kind of a dialectical process. It's always a kind of a very, 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 very important dynamics involved in that. So he argues that the concept of identity as territorialization is important to understand cultural debates about identity. So if you look at identity as territorialization, you want to create your space of influence, your realm of influence in a particular way. And that is exactly what identity making means. You want to create a kind of a particular identity to your place where you live, the kind of and again please keep in mind that I'm not talking about a geographic place, a given place. Okay, that space could be moving, that space could be a visual, it could be an imaginary space. Okay, so in such scenario, you create a kind of an artificial territory, and this territorialization is very closely connected with the notion of identity. And so it is important to understand the connection between this territorialization and the role of identity in its building. So he invokes Doreen Massey, a very important British geographer, a well-known British geographer, discusses the geography of a culture as consisting of interconnections that cross multiple spaces. Okay, so discusses geography of a culture as consisting of interconnections that cross multiple spaces. So these two terms are extremely important. One is interconnections and that cross multiple spaces. So we will come across these terms and concepts many number of times in the coming classes, but these are important. So the geography of a culture is consisting of interconnections that cross multiple spaces. She writes, the interconnections which bind together and internally differentiate a diaspora culture, for instance, cut across regions, nation states and continents, linking local areas in, say, a British city to a Turkish region of Cyprus, to a particular island in the Caribbean or a village in India. Okay, so how do a group of people who have, say, migrated from Punjab to Canada or to UK, how do they create a kind of a kind of identity, Indian identity or Punjabi identity for them in this particular foreign land? How do they create a sense of Indianness there? What does it mean to be a Punjabi there, or what does it mean to be a kind of a Punjabi culture there? How do they construct an Indian culture or a Punjabi culture there? Is it a kind of a direct transport of cultural elements from India or Punjab to these places? No, she says that they are cut across regions, nation states and continents, linked local areas. Okay, so it's not only about the geographical spaces, but also they're extremely selective. They undergo very significant transformations. Their character undergo change. They will hold on to maybe some of the important things. They might let go a lot of other things. They might renegotiate a lot of things. So it's a very fascinating scenario where you see that how there is a very conscious process of acceptance, of omission, of commission, of a host of things in order to create a kind of a particular claim to a kind of a culture. So rather than thinking of culture as root, this is something very important. I found it very interesting as well. Rather than thinking of culture as root, as people belonging to a particular place and traditions and practices, we need to think of cultures as roots, as the movement of people, goods, ideas from place to place. This is something extremely important, because when you talk about culture, we always think of something that your culture is the place where you are born because you are deeply rooted in that culture. Okay, so rootedness gives you an idea of being a sense of permanence. You are deeply ingrained into that particular soil, that particular tradition, that particular culture. There is a sense of permanence to this particular idea of root. But Massey argues that that's a very erroneous understanding, because we think that your host culture has been unchanging for the past centuries. It never changed. Okay, so that is why you think that you are rooted in that, you are representing that you are representing the essence of that particular culture. And this is a very erroneous understanding. If you look into your own culture, okay, a host of things that you consider as your own, the kind of food that you eat, the kind of dress, the kind of language, the kind of utensils that you have, the kind of artifacts, the kind of ideas, religious system, belief system, all these things have reached you from various places. Okay, this could be hardly anything which can be said that as something originated in a place where you live, and this is something extremely important. Okay, this is something extremely important, and this will also help you to move beyond some of the very myopic understanding about the arguments about cultural chauvinism. arguing that my culture is superior to others, and then I will not allow others to come and then pollute my culture. These kind of arguments come from very erroneous, very shallow, very narrow understanding of what does culture mean. Okay, all these places wherever human beings have inhabited from the past so many centuries have been a part of a larger networks, larger global flows. Okay, they were part of larger movements of ideas, artifacts, belief systems, value systems. Okay, a lot of material as well as non-material aspects of culture. So Massey argued that instead of looking at culture as root, you need to understand culture as roots, as the movements of peoples, of goods, ideas from place to place. So then you understand that the kind of culture that you want to claim, okay, it's a product of so many different cultural roots that have happened in history, and you or your community happen to take birth in a particular time. That is why you were able to you were able to be seen as the representatives of that culture. Okay, but that culture was not something immutable. It was not something permanent. It was always in the flux. But you happened to take birth at a particular time, and then you think that everything was there from the beginning, and you started making claim about it. So what is very important for Massey is that these interconnections are actually social relations, and as such have varying levels and types of power, and that power is directional. So some social relations have more cultural power than others. So this also an extremely important point, saying that these things are not very innocent in that sense. They are not devoid of power relations. Okay, they are not devoid of power relations. They are not happening as if on a level playing field. Okay, they are not happening on a level playing field. We know the story of colonialism. We know the story of slavery. We know how a host of native cultures have been completely decimated by the colonial aggression through genocide and a host of other things. Okay, so starting from that kind of very obvious atrocities to more gradual cultural influence. Okay, these cultural flows have taken place throughout history. They have been taking place in the history, from the time immemorial. Okay, but they are articulated through social relations, and the moment they are articulated through social relations, then obviously the role of power comes into picture. Okay, and why that certain culture was able to move from one to another, why that particular kind of a cultural diffusion took place. Okay, what were the circumstances under which a religion like Islam was able to spread to different parts of the country, or why is that Buddhism was able to travel from India to Southeast Asian countries, to Sri Lanka, to China, a host of other places. Okay, so we know that it's not only the importance or significance of those ideas of Buddhism, but also there were very specific social relations that facilitated the movement of Buddhism, or any religion for that matter, from one place to the another. Another very important point of debate, which we will take up more closely in the coming classes, is about the question of cultural imperialism. Okay, so what is happening to overall culture? So we agree that there has been cultural flows, there has been cultural networks happening everywhere, but there has been a lot of very interesting, important questions about what is the nature of these cultural transformations. Okay, and what is the role of power in that. Okay, and why that certain cultures becoming very dominating at the cost of other cultures, and why that certain other cultures are simply disappearing, not being able to compete with the kind of an invading culture. So that has really led to a lot of discussions about what we understand as the questions of cultural imperialism. Okay, imperialism, it's a term used in the Marxian discourse to talk about the kind of a combination of both political exploitation as well as economic exploitation. The Lenin's arguments about imperialism is something very important. So there are scholars within Marxian tradition who very firmly believe that even after the formal ending of colonialism, Okay, the imperialism continue. The economic logic of imperialism continues even after the formal ending of colonialism. Or in other words, you no longer requires a physical domination over the colonies to continue with your economic exploitation. The trade is more than sufficient for that. So, extending that argument into the realm of culture, there are very interesting arguments about the whole question of cultural imperialism. Okay, so cultural imperialism argues that while the old political empires have crumbled, the Western nations still control the symbolic and cultural world by controlling the mass media. Okay, so we know that Britain is no longer an important colonizer. Almost every country under the British Empire has been declared as independent, and Britain is no longer a colonizer. No other country is a colonizer, at least in the most of the times. But what happens is that the Western nations still control the symbolic and cultural world by controlling the mass media. So there is a huge imbalance in terms of power, okay, appropriated or unleashed by these Western countries, especially the US, across the globe. And that's the argument that and that is, there's a huge imbalance in terms of the power that these few countries hold, and that leads to a kind of a cultural imperialism, that leads to a kind of a scenario where the American culture or European culture, now increasingly American culture, European culture may be up to 1950s, but after that what we are seeing is the emergence of this bipolar world, the USA, USSR and then America. But America became more powerful or efficient because they adopted a capitalist system in which the commercial aspect of the culture, the possibilities of expansion is much more than that of a communist country. So the problem with cultural imperialism thesis is that it assumes that the process of globalization is a one-way flow from the West, that is read America, to the rest. This process is uniform and occurs in the same way everywhere. That is, it assumes that the world will become homogenized, that it will look like the same everywhere, wherever you go. So this has been an extremely important argument, and it's been used, say, like Coca-colonization. There is another term. Coca-colonization is that Coca-Cola is colonizing the beverage market of the whole world, which is true. If you look into every society, every country, you know that these two beverages brands, this PepsiCo and Coca-Cola, they have almost near monopoly across the globe, and they have purchased the local brands, and then so that's how they have penetrated deep into every society. So these terms like Coca-colization or Coca-colonization have become so powerful terms to indicate this kind of a cultural invasion of the commercial as well as cultural interest from the European countries or from that of the America. Okay, so this assumes that it's only one directional flow. It's, in other words, it's known as Americanization, a term which was very widely used during 1990s and then at least up to early 2000s. That there is America is expanding its tentacles. America is expanding its influence across the globe, not through military or not through physical force, but through cultural means, through its products, through its movies, okay, through its TV shows, through its cartoons, through a host of other things. So it is leading to a kind of a homogenization, and the world will become almost same everywhere. Your food habits will become same, your consumption will become same, the kind of dress pattern, the kind of dress brand, the kind of music that you listen to, all these things will become one and the same. So this is a kind of an argument about cultural imperialism, but we know that it's only one side of the story. While it is very important, they are not really talking about this whole reception part. Okay, we know that even if something is imposed on people, people don't accept it the way the originally it was intended. People use different ways of acceptance. For example, another very controversial work, political scientist Benjamin Barber, in an influential yet problematic book titled Jihad versus Macworld, argued that globalization actually consists of two different processes working in opposite directions. So one, he argued about this Mac world, which includes everything which starts with Mac, McDonald, Microsoft, MGM films, and so almost everything that has its origin in the US, but it is expanding throughout the world. Okay, so this Mac world, according to Benjamin Barber, stands everything for good. It's for progress, it's for development, it's for rationality, it's for people's freedom, people's choice, everything good. On the other hand, he calls it's against jihad in a very problematic adoption of this term from Quran, or from so where he talks about everything that is negative, which is traditional, which is violent, which is inward looking, which is against development, which is full of violence. So he argues that while this Mac world is expanding, this the other opposite tendency is also expanding with the same efficiency or same speed. So but we know that these are not kind of binary forces. Okay, they are not in two opposite directions. What we are increasingly realizing, and it will become more clear when we take up the subsequent classes, what we are seeing is a kind of a multi-directional cultural flows. Okay, it's not a one unidirectional or in two direction or three direction. They are in a completely multi-directional flows. So global content, okay, content distributed globally is given a local form through the interpretations and discussions of the audience that consume it. In a similar way, global culture can be appropriated for local use to make a local statement about the identity. So there is a lot of interesting argument about how a global content is given a local form through interpretations and discussions of the audience that consume it. And it will become clear when we discuss, for example, McDonaldization, or even huge any multinational companies who come to Indian society for that matter, or any society for that matter. They have to accept and then adapt into that, because you won't get a beef burger in India. McDonald's will not sell a beef burger, but they sell beef burgers in a host of other countries. So in order to respect the local sentiments, or a veg burger may not be a big hit for them elsewhere, but in India it's an important thing. So every such process of cultural influence is not a very blind kind of a process. It's a more complicated one, where there are a lot of negotiations and bargaining takes place, and then it's a much more complicated process. In a similar way, global culture can be appropriated for local use to make a local statement about the identity. Richard Wilk argues that the nature of globalization, of global capitalism, and therefore global cultural hegemony has changed. Global capitalism no longer promotes homogeneity. It is not trying to mass produce one widget for the entire world. So this is a very, very important argument of Richard Wilk. He says that the global capitalism does not want to create a uniform world, because it will be detrimental to its own interest. There's no need why global capitalism has to produce a uniform set of demands and needs and products and everything for the society. It's actually not something good for them. Rather, the global capitalism would be best served if it has a much more broader kind of options. So what global capitalism does today is that it actually promotes differences, the new, the exotic, and it thrives on differences. But it promotes only a certain type of difference and ignores other differences. It promotes the type of differences that can be easily packaged and sold, the type of differences that are not threatening to global capitalism. By promoting a limited range of difference, it limits the range of actions available to people. Wilk refers to this as structures of common difference. Very, very important argument. Okay, they want, if you have noticed some of these advertisements. So these advertisements directly address you, and then it wants you to be different. Okay, it wants each one of you to be different. But how can you be different? You can be different not by consuming their product, but by consuming their product. Okay, so they would assure you that by consuming their product you will be different from others. And ironically, this is their argument to everybody. Okay, that's what we see in a front page advertisement of the newspaper. They want you to drink a particular soft drink, and you know that in none of these advertisements they will talk about the quality of the drink, because there is nothing to speak about as the quality of a or the nutrition value of a soft drink. They're all selling a kind of a particular attitude. Okay, they're all selling a kind of an attitude to the consumer, not the quality of the product, because they know that there is nothing to talk about as the quality of a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi or anything. Okay, there is nothing other than some sugar and some carbonated water. So they are selling an attitude. Okay, they are asking you to be different, but ironically that everybody will end up differently, but ultimately it all will be the same. So capitalism wants you to be act differently, think that you're different, but ultimately it serves the purpose of capitalism, because capitalism is able to offer you very limited set of options by giving you an illusion that you are actually the choosers. Okay, but we are not the actual choosers. We the options are very limited. We only get to choose from what is being offered. So Wilk raises this interesting question: what if the global content is local, but it is expressed in a foreign or global form? So he talks about it in that sense. The content could be very local, but it is expressed in this in a global form. Examples of video productions, YouTube channels, theme parks, and a host of other things. So can we then say that they are all examples of cultural imperialism? Okay, because the form might be, for example, some of the very popular TV shows, something like Big Boss. Okay, Big Boss is a foreign show. But whom you see in your regional TV channels are your own local heroes, local people, and it has a very specific local flavor. Okay, so that is a very interesting combination of a global form with a local content. Now, do you call it as cultural imperialism? Okay, what kind of culture does it really represent? So, what makes globalization new? So now, if you are kind of trying to sum up these discussions, we know that the kind of a cultural exchanges, if you go back to Massey's argument about looking at culture not as roots but as roots, these interchanges, these exchanges, these interactions have been there from the past several centuries. Okay, but what is happening now is the scale of this interaction, the degree of this interaction, the intensity of this particular interaction. Okay, so what makes globalization new is a sense of world as a whole that not only one is aware of other people and places, but there is a sense of simultaneity and interconnection, that events and decisions made in far off places can have consequences for your everyday life, and what your everyday life can have consequences for many others a world away. So this really captures the essence of globalization. And Roland Robertson, one of the important theorists of globalization, he defines the concept of globalization as referring to both to the compression of the world and the intensification of consciousness of world as a whole. Okay, so there is a compression of the world, which is also comes up here, that the things that happen here will have a immediate consequence somewhere else. The incidents that happen there will have immediate consequences here. So they're all talking about a kind of a compression of the world, and the kind of intensification of consciousness of the world as a whole. Okay. So one of the very important aspects of globalization is the increased global consciousness. The idea that we are all living in a global world. Okay, and let me end this class by showing a very interesting quote from Shashi Tharoor. Shashi Tharoor, as you know, is an MP from Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala, and he is known for his oratory skills. He was with the UN, and then he's a very popular MP who has very high level of mastery over English. His vocabulary is supposed to be very good. So this is a very famous definition of, not definition as such, a kind of an illustration of globalization, which is taken from one of his speeches that he delivered in Boston in the US. So let's see what Shashi Tharoor is, how is he explaining. So he's talking about Princess Diana's death. That tragic incident where she had a car accident and then passed away. So he's elaborating that incident. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with an Egyptian companion who supplanted Pakistani. She gets into a German car with a Dutch engine that is driven by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish whiskey. They are then chased by the Italian paparazzi on Japanese scooters and motorbikes into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is briefly attempted by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines. And the whole story is told to you in Boston by the Indian MP from Thiruvananthapuram. That is globalization by Shashi Tharoor. This is just an incident. Of course, we can imagine that he must have used his artistic freedom to make it more elaborate, but it's a very illustrative one, a simple incident of Diana's death and how global it was. Okay, how global it was, how many global players were party to that, and how you will not be able to understand that particular incident if you don't have the kind of a larger understanding of that the interconnectedness of that particular incident. So let me end the class by saying that we are just into some of the interesting discussions on cultural globalization, and we'll have the classes in the next session. Okay, thank you.